Welcome to Running with the Pack, Episode 8. I'm Paul Bishop, the Acquisition Editor for Wolfpack Publishing. And with me today for this conversation is my buddy, Brian Drake. How you doing, buddy?
Good, Paul. How are you?
Great. You were up in the San Francisco Bay Area, is that right?
About 40 miles east, yeah.
And you've been there a long time, even before you started this writing gig, right? You've been in broadcasting up there?
Yeah. Boy, I think it's 25 years now in radio and television, mostly radio. And as you can see, I've got my microphone here. I'm talking into a camera. This is the only way I can talk to anybody now, is it's with these tools. And otherwise, I just kind of stare.
Technology has really changed everything for us. I mean, I'm doing all of these things from home as opposed to in a studio. And as I was telling you before we came on the air, it's strange having to do all this jury-rigged stuff to get it to work, but somehow or other we're getting through it. So
it doesn't seem like it should work. I'm broadcasting out of the master bedroom here now, and I would show you, but it's not very exciting. But I've got a mixing console, the microphone, a few other things, and a big mass of cables and wires. And I'm always afraid if I touch something just the wrong way, everything's going to short out. And I have no idea how to fix it if that happens.
Can you just check your mic for me?
Check my mic?
There you go. Okay, there you go. Yeah, you were breaking up there a little bit. So Lauren will edit this bit out.
Okay. What did I tell you about touching wires?
Yes, exactly. You know, fortunately for you and I as writers, all this technology glitches doesn't really affect us much. As long as we've got our keyboard, we're pretty good to go.
Keyboard or a pen and a piece of paper, yeah. I do a lot of longhand writing. Yeah, not as much as I used to because I get the wrist cramp right here. But I still like to scribble that way just to get ideas, that sort of thing.
Now, I think you and I go way back to when we were writing fight card novels.
Oh, yeah.
Now, for any of our viewers who don't know what that means, Fight Card was a 50-book series. Can you believe that? 50 books.
I didn't know there were 50.
Yeah, and a lot of us who were all friends at that time, writers, contributed to that series. You did, of course I did, Mel Odom, Eric Beetner, other Wolfpack authors. We all kind of came together there originally, and now we're back together again with Wolfpack, which is really a cool deal because we got some good history together.
I think of that. My family knows that book as the boxing book. That just seems to be the only way I could describe it to them, where they would go, "Oh, okay." And that's one of the many projects I've done that I wish I could have done a little bit better. You know, it's like if you're knowing, I mean, had I known then what I know now, it would have been significantly different. It would have been significantly longer. But
we write the best book we can right now. I mean, that was a very hard lesson for me to learn. Mm-hmm. I would look at books by other writers who I admire and despair, thinking I'm never going to be able to write that good of a book. But I can write the best book I can write right now, and each book will hopefully be better. Now, you've learned along the way. You've got a lot of books under your belt now. What have been some of the biggest lessons you've learned in the writing career? Besides the sound of deadlines whooshing by.
Well, I think some of the bigger lessons were the hardest ones, like how to create a believable character, or how to create a character that had identifiable traits, something that could cause a reader to identify with this person. I was very good at stereotypes, but I was always told everything is very flat, and none of these people are coming alive. And it was right after I sold a short story to an anthology that was edited by Michael Bracken, who's a tremendous short story writer. He accepted one story I did for one anthology, and then he rejected the next two that I sent him for two more anthologies. And finally, so those plus a bunch of other comments of the same sort and some other rejections, I sent him an email and I said, "Hey, you liked one. what didn't you like about the other two? And also, have you noticed this such and such about my characters? And he said, yes, I have. And I said, great. How do I fix it? You know, and what followed was, and I saved all the emails. It was a tremendous 2-3 week back and forth about, this is how I create characters. This is how you deal with traits and personalities. That's helped. I discovered Harry Whittington at one point in an essay he wrote where he said, I always gave a character a behavior trait where if they had a chance to prove or disprove that trait, they would always choose to prove it. And then I read some of his books and examples of that. I was like, wow, you know, so this is how it's done. And I guess I was in my mid-20s at that point. I'd already been writing for 10 or 15 years, so you can imagine how frustrating it was that I certainly had the basic skills. I could plot, I could, you know, I can do all that, but I couldn't create a character that was very interesting. After,
you know, one of the things that I find in reading a lot of manuscripts is people also don't know how to create a villain. A villain who is just evil for being evil is not very interesting.
Right.
Right? I want to know why he's evil. What is his motivation? Can I have any sympathy or understanding, perhaps, with the villain and what they're doing? Just the fact that, you know, he's an evil megalomaniac, that leaves the book flat for me. And the other thing that I find is if you, in the beginning of the book, you make a big deal out of your character being an expert dart thrower. At some point in the book, you better throw a dart or something that brings that information around.
Right.
And I learned that from Dick Francis, who was kind of the pattern that I followed. I didn't know him personally at that time, but I think I've told this story before. I learned to plot by taking 2 of his books, the same book, 2 copies of it, tearing out all the pages and putting them on my office floor and going through and learning how he plotted the beats of his plots. But it was the same thing with characters. And I think you're right. And Harry Whittington is, you know, I've got to give them a flaw of some kind to make them interesting. You can't be Superman all the time.
Well, and it wasn't even Superman. It was just, they didn't do anything. They were just in the room. And yet this was the hero, this was the villain, this was the sidekick or the girlfriend. But that was it. And they sounded the same, and they just had nothing to separate themselves from one another. And it was probably the best lesson. It was also the toughest because it was the one thing holding me back. And it was like, until I cracked that code, then I wasn't going anywhere.
Well, and once you crack the code, now you've got a lot of thrillers under your belt. And how do you build your character into somebody who can survive all of those many thrilling situations that you put them into? I mean, there's a certain amount of expected suspension of disbelief, but you still have to have your character be in jeopardy during the course of the book. He may fail.
Right.
And I think that's a lesson that needs to be learned. And quite frankly, why I don't read a lot of thrillers for free reading, because I don't believe the characters can do all that stuff.
Yeah, there was a trick that Ian Fleming used where at some point in the book, James Bond is going to be captured and tortured. And it's going to look as if he's not going to win. And then somehow he turns the tables and he does win. And that's probably a trick I've used a little too much. But you have to have, it goes back to the strong villain. You have to have a villain that's smart enough to defeat the hero. They have to be either equal to each other, or the villain has to be a little bit smarter. And the villain has to be able to defeat this superhero and look like he's actually going to, and then you actually have suspense. I mean, one person running around a track isn't very suspenseful. Put 2 people there, and suddenly you've got a nice little story.
You got a race on your hands.
Yeah.
And I think the art of writing yourself into a corner is a good thing, because if you write yourself into a corner and can figure your way out of it, the reader will continue reading to see how you figure your way out of it.
Yeah. But are you referring to writing without an outline, or?
Not necessarily. I think as you build your plot and you build your character, you put a hill in front of them and then a mountain in front of them, and then you push them to the edge of the ledge. And then the interesting thing is, how does he get off the ledge?
Right. I used to write without an outline because I think it was something Lawrence Block did, you know, and I wanted to be just like Lawrence Block. So I wrote without an outline, and I wrote myself into many corners and threw out a whole lot of half-finished manuscripts because I couldn't find a way out. And that's when I decided that I'm going to plot out everything first, and the outline then becomes something I create as I go, and where I can take the time to find those corners and get out of them. And I haven't written 300 pages and don't get frustrated with it. It's easier to throw out a 5-page outline than a 500-page manuscript. And that I have found helps me write a lot better and a lot faster. And I know a lot of people don't like outlines, but the way I look at it is the outline is I've built the house, the manuscript and the process of typing it is now I get to decorate and play around in it. And it just takes a lot of the pressure off.
Now, your latest series of books, I know that your Steve Dane character is making an appearance again, but your Scott Stiletto thrillers, how did you go about devising that character and that series? And what was it you intended to do with it?
Oh boy, how much time do we have? Because, you know, Scott Stiletto goes back to me scribbling ideas in math class in 7th grade when I should have been paying attention to what was on the board. You know.
Why? Have you used algebra yet today?
No. Yeah, right. So no, I came up with Stiletto. I mean, I was writing fan fiction before it had a name, and whatever. If it was, James Bond, Man from U.N.C.L.E., whatever show I was watching, I would write stories for that show until I found myself creating my own guest characters to interact with Napoleon Solo or whoever it was. And that's how Stiletto first showed up. He was a bit player. And then I thought, well, let's make him the main character. Let's forget about these other guys and write about Scott. So that's where he started. And to finally be able to do 8 books in that series was tremendous. My inner 14-year-old was very happy. That being said, I had no plan. And you can tell when you read the books because there are, well, maybe you can't, but I can tell. There are choices I made, ideas that sounded good at the time that I did not think, how is this going to affect things 4 books down the line? And here we go back to writing yourself into a corner. I put Stiletto in a spot and it took me 5 books to get him out of it.
With The Dangerous Mr. Wolf, is that a one-off for you, or are you going to go back and revisit that character?
No, that was a challenge that some of my other writer pals and I kicked around. And I think I'm the only one who did it. I mean, in fact, it was 2 of our colleagues, Jack Baudelaire and Mark Allen, where Jack's idea was to put up as many stories as possible, as fast as possible. So I thought, well, short stories are the best way to do that. So I came up with this Wolf fellow, and I put him through his paces. The stories actually did do well, and then I did the novel, and then I got bored with them. I just didn't think that in a contemporary setting, the kind of Mac Bolan style vigilante was going to play very well. And then I think at the end of the novel, I put him in a car and he's driving away from whatever city he's in. And I thought, well, he'll just go from town to town solving problems. And I thought, Lee Child's already doing that, so I just had to heck with it. So it's at this, unless an idea really comes into me that is perfect for him and something I have to use, no, he's probably done his time. And I think I have a visitor behind me. So,
Buster.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see him, but yeah, the cat is here.
My Max was just in here, and that's why all of a sudden the light came on my face, because he knocked over my shade. I think he did it on purpose. With the Team Reaper books, now you wrote that with some other authors. You wrote individual books, but there were a group of authors writing those tales. How was it different writing for a group of heroes as opposed to writing for a singular hero?
It was very tough. It was the toughest part of that project because I suddenly had, I think, 5 people to juggle in a scene, and finding stuff for everybody to say and do was tough. I solved it by sending them all off in different directions, and they all would accomplish different parts of the mission separately and then come together at the end. But yeah, that was a real challenge.
When you now set out to create a new character, what is the first thing that you look for to make him different than Scott Stiletto, Steve Dane, the Reaper crew? What do you look for to make it different?
Well, I just had to do that with the new Sam Raven series we're going to be starting next year, because what I didn't want was to be told this is Stiletto under a different name, you know, and a lot of authors have fallen into that trap. And so the first thing I did is that I still wanted an independent hero who wasn't necessarily an official secret agent or anything like that, someone who can work on his own. And already you can draw comparisons with Dane and Stiletto on that. So instead I gave him a rather vague backstory, a little bit more mystery behind who he is and why he does what he does. His last name is Raven, so I gave him a gun called the Talon. The Nighthawk Custom Talon is a $3,000 pistol that is more expensive than anything I've ever purchased in that area. And I thought that was a nice character tag where, you know, a raven shoots a talon. Ravens have their big claws or talons, you know, it just seemed to fit. I gave him a bit more of a code to live by. You know, there are 2 rules. He doesn't, rule number 1 is no gunfights in public. Number 2, no roots. He doesn't want to settle down for various reasons. And Stiletto and Dane don't have anything like that. You know, and it's, and then the stories themselves, I created a specific format for the stories at the risk of being criticized for repeating things all the time. I just thought it would be great if, you know, the Raven stories have X. You can always expect this. And my job is to shuffle those things around so they're not always the same. But that's a very long-winded way of saying I did try to make this fellow different than the other guys.
And you have now signed a 3-book contract with Wolfpack for the Sam Raven books.
Yes, which I actually wasn't expecting. The way our deals worked so far the rest of the year, I write something, I send it in, and we just do 1 book at a time, which I thought is what would happen with Raven. And I did, you know, the first Raven is different enough than Stiletto where it's like, I'm not sure they're going to go for it. So let's send it in. Let's make sure that this is something they want. And not only did they want it, they signed me for 3. So that was very gratifying. So,
always nice to have work.
That's right. And the other nice thing is I've stockpiled books. So 1 is sent in, 2, there's a couple changes I want to make before that's ready. And I just started 3. So we're on our way to pumping them out as fast as we can.
Now you write them at about 60,000 to 70,000 words?
Yeah, I'm trying very hard to get closer to 70,000. I seem to be able to do 60 standing on my head, hungover, very easily. But going beyond that is extremely tough for me. So I'm trying to learn how to do it without filling the books with padding that doesn't need to be there. I mean, 'cause I don't know about you, but in some of the modern stuff I read, there's stuff in there that can be cut out and it doesn't affect the story at all. It's just there to fill pages.
I just happened to be asked to review a screenplay for a movie or script. And one of the things I said to him is, you've got at least half a dozen completely superfluous characters that if you took them out of the screenplay, it wouldn't affect a thing. And I think that's the same thing that we see in modern day thrillers, what we call the doorstop thrillers, is that there's just this plethora of unnecessary characters, unnecessary subplots, when I think you and I are used to growing up on, 180-page Gold Fawcett Westerns,
right,
and thrillers. So, but I think what you're saying is that you are still stretching yourself as a writer by moving into a little bit longer version of what you do. And how long does that take you to do a book at 60 to 70,000 words? Because you have a full-time day job.
I do, yeah. And I'll tell you what, this lockdown has been the best thing ever because I don't have to commute, so I've got all this extra time now. And with Raven, the first one, Terminal Memory, I wrote that in a month at 64,000 words, I think. And then the next month I did Wicked City, and that's just a hair over 60,000. And that's with, you know, all the extra time I have now. When I was doing Stiletto and Team Reaper, you know, I mean, I would work on both books each day, about 2,000 words each. It was, you know, about putting me in the funhouse. Those I managed to do in 3 or 4 months. So it like I said, being stuck at home has certainly helped my productivity.
Well, it's a matter of putting your butt in the chair behind the, you know, word processor, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but I don't have a 2-hour commute to deal with either. So that it helps with the time and the energy and all kinds of things.
So what books or what writers inspired you when you were younger? Did you just want to tell stories naturally, or were there things that you read that you went, I really want to do this?
Well, it didn't start quite that way. The first thing that happened was when I was 10 years old, my father bought a video camera, and some buddies and I thought it would be fun to make our own little movie. So, you know, we're at the park or some other places. Dad's got the camera.
So you live next door to Steven Spielberg then, right? So you and he went out and did Super 8 stuff. Is that right? Is that what you're telling me?
I wish we'd been that creative. But no, we just ran around shooting guns at each other. You know, one side was the good guys, these were the bad guys. And I suddenly got the idea, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we had a script and we could say things and do scenes? And so I started typing what I thought was the screenplay for this stuff. And having grown up on James Bond and stuff like that, I wanted to go to Paris and shoot at the Eiffel Tower and do all this fancy stuff. Well, no one's going to let a bunch of 10-year-olds do that. So I thought, well, if I rewrite this as a short story, I can do whatever I want. And that's kind of where it began, except I hadn't read any short stories. I didn't know how to write anything. Most of my reading at that time was either comic books or Mad Magazine. So,
Did you have any teachers at school who encouraged this in you, or did they do what a lot of teachers do and crush your dreams, saying you'll never write anything that's worth reading?
No, it wasn't until much later that I found an English teacher that actually was somewhat supportive, after accusing me of plagiarism one time. But so I didn't know how to write anything. So eventually I had to start reading, and of course I discovered that James Bond had been books before movies by that point, so I started reading those books. Once I finished those, I had to go find other books, so that led me to everything else. And that's how I learned how to write. I never really went back to screenplays or anything, never thought about doing movies again. Suddenly I found this new way of telling stories. I'd been writing for as long as I could remember, but mostly comic books. I would do my own comics with very crude drawings, by the way. So I always had some sort of storytelling mode in my head, and it took, you know, Dad's video camera and the influence of Ian Fleming and a few other things to maybe put it on paper instead of on video.
If there was one book that you could write that you have in your head as the perfect book that you want to write, what would it be?
You mean one that's already been done, or one
No, one that do you have a secret book deep in your heart that you haven't told anybody about that you're about to reveal to us? A book that you'd really like to write.
Okay. Well, there's two, actually. I would love to do the definitive fictional account of Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral conflict. And then, you know, my family is from Montana, and Butte, Montana specifically, which was a mining town, copper. They mined copper there. One side was in business, the other in politics, and there was a lot of stuff going on in Butte in the 50s. And that's why, I mean, going back to Fight Card, that took place in Butte, and I used a lot of family stuff in there. But I would like to expand on that and create some sort of Harold Robbins style saga starting at the end of World War II and going into the 60s. So, so it's not ambitious at all, but that's something I've had in the back of my head for a while.
Well, Brian, I appreciate you being with me today. Thanks for sharing some of your thoughts on writing and the books that you have going. Good luck with the Sam Raven series. I'm really looking forward to that. And we will talk again soon, my friend. Take care.
All right, thanks. You too.